Welcome back. It has been a busy 24 hours for the Trump transition team. In addition to prepping for his White House meeting with President Biden next hour, the president-elect has announced a handful of key picks for his new administration. The latest batch focuses on national security. Trump has tapped Fox News host Pete Hegseth to be his defense secretary, a pick that took some Republicans on the Hill by surprise. He also announced John Ratcliffe will be returning to his administration, this time as CIA director. Ratcliffe, you'll recall, served as director of national intelligence in the final months of Trump's first term. And I also want to bring in now a pair of former national security officials. Former Trump-Pence Homeland Security staffer Olivia Troy and former senior director at the National Security Council, Michael Allen. So, Michael, this incoming defense secretary pick, Pete Hegseth, he's a combat veteran, Fox News host. Here's what he has said recently about how he wants to reshape the Department of Defense. Listen.
You got to fire, you got to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you got to fire this. I mean, obviously, you're going to bring in a new Secretary of Defense, but any general that was involved, general, admiral, whatever, that was involved in any of the DEI woke, it's got to go. I think a huge one is women in combat and quotas. I think the way they pushed that under Obama in a way that had nothing, zero to do with efficacy, zero to do with lethality and capability.
You don't like women in combat?
No.
So it appears that at least one of his priorities is fighting this internal sort of culture war at the department. What message does that send to allies and adversaries?
Well, the message I think they should receive is that Trump, of course, is an unconventional president, and he's gone for an unconventional pick. Trump purposefully wants someone that's disruptive. He doesn't want to draw on someone from the defense establishment. His experience, right or wrong, in the first term was that his first national security cabinet had their own policy preferences in mind rather than Trump's priorities. So I think this is something Pete Hegseth is going to have to stand in front of the Congress, stand in front of the media, explain himself. Right now, we know he's a decorated veteran, and he's an Ivy-educated, Ivy League pedigreed person. And look, the way our Congress works, all of these issues that may arise about what he said in the past will be surfaced and thoroughly audited.
And Olivia, we just have some news in right now. The transition team confirming that Stephen Miller and Dan Scavino will return to the White House with Trump. You spoke earlier about how border czar Tom Homan, had some concerns of yours. What's your reaction to Miller's official return?
Well, I think we are very clear on who's going to be running policy across the board. And in that role, I have no doubt that he will be overseeing the entire policy apparatus, whether it's the National Security Council and throughout the federal government. This is something that he really aspired to do. This is something that he worked very hard to do during the first Trump administration, except now he's been granted the official reins and role.
NBC is reporting that Trump is planning to purge top Pentagon officers, and the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that Trump's team is considering a plan to create a board of retired service members who could recommend the firing of generals. Michael, what do you think about this idea of a review board, and what would the dismantling of people in the military currently, especially in those leadership positions, mean?
Well, my first reaction is, as the commander-in-chief, he, of course, has the plenary authority to do whatever he wants within the confines of the U.S. military and, of course, within the executive branch. But this is a hangover from what President Trump feels like he experienced in his first term, where he faulted Chairman Milley and others for seeming to work outside of his chain of command. And there's a broad view, I think, among Trump folks coming into the government that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and others in the General's Officers Corps may not support Trump and feel like they're independent. That's not my experience with that group of people. I think that they will salute and execute lawful orders, but we're going to have to work through a process in the intelligence community and within the Department of Defense Officer Corps so that the president has restored trust in them. I think there's going to be transparency, there's going to be accountability, there's going to be disruption, but at the end of the day, I think the president will find these are loyal Americans who are doing their best for American national security.
But I can't help but wonder if a purge, as we've used that word, if that could put America in a vulnerable position.
It would depend on how broad it would be and under what grounds people were being purged for. But I think when they look at the General Officer Corps, they're going to find that entire generations were not sort of spiked with DEI and are not working for a sort of climate agenda. Some would have been. Some of that's honestly from the Biden political appointees, not so much the General Officer Corps. So I think once they look into this, once they get more comfortable, and that's why Pete Hegseth, he has the president's trust.
Yeah.
And if Hegseth looks at it and says it's going fine, or we only, had to take the following actions, that might be good enough, and we can get down to the business of securing the country from national security threats.
Olivia, I want to ask about another pick, John Ratcliffe as CIA director. As you know, he was Trump's director of national intelligence in 2020. And January 6th witness Cassidy Hutchinson testified that as DNI, Ratcliffe wanted nothing to do with Trump's post-election scheme and advised White House staff not to go along with that. Does it surprise you Trump would bring him back after that? And does it give you any reassurance?
Well, I think out of all the picks, I think that one certainly could have been worse. So at least I was sort of relieved to see that it was him. I do think that this group will operate together regardless, however, and I do think that these are true loyalists to the Donald Trump agenda. I will go back to something, though, about following the rule of law here, and the Pentagon. What really concerns me about that, Anna, is the fact that this is someone who's going to be at the helm of people who do serve in a nonpartisan way. This is someone who has personally chosen to go on talk radio and on podcasts that are with right-wing conspiracy theorist people that are completely out there in the right-wing agenda. And so I question that type of personality and their loyalty to the Constitution when they decide to go on fear-mongering channels like that and the type of leadership they're going to exhibit before the world.